On this episode of the podcast, I have with me Sen Xu. He's the head of engineering Replica. He's actually got a fantastic background. He's worked at some immense, big, large enterprises, but we're going to focus on what Replica does and some of the challenges they've been trying to solve. I know a lot of it's around urban planning and how the old school view of it doesn't work. We're going to cover a few topics around scale, which I think is super important since Replica is absolutely has a great trajectory of growth and a potential for a big impact in the way everyone operates. And I appreciate him spending time with us on this podcast. Sen, thank you very much.
Hey, Amir, thanks a lot for inviting me.
Absolutely.
Absolutely a pleasure to talk on the podcast and share what we are doing.
Absolutely. So maybe to that point, I just kind of briefly just mentioned what Replica does. I think it's a pretty interesting, pretty complex solution you guys are bringing to market. Maybe give us a little overview of what the company does as a whole, and then we'll kind of kick it off.
Replica, as you mentioned, focused on people's movement data. We are currently an enterprise data platform that delivers critical insights about the built environment. So it's about physical world. And I love the fact that you mentioned that the old urban planning framework doesn't really work. It's actually not the issue with the old urban planning framework. It doesn't work. It's actually about data. And what Replica does is that with better data and human context and better design, and Replica, we can help public and private sectors make more informed, more effective, and responsive decisions. And by showing how people live, move, and work, we contextualize hard choices and allow our client to see around corners and understand the trade-offs surrounding their decision. Like a city planner increasing public transit to underserved neighborhoods, or for like a grocery chain, or to evaluate where to open a new location, or real estate developer. Replica, we provide insight to let client make more informed, people-centered decision.
Awesome, man. I think just to having kind of spoke to you before and kind of looked at what the company does, it seems like there's a real tangible impact that what you guys are doing can actually bring to a city. And it's probably something that day to day we'd probably never know about because it all just happens, at a much different level than we're used to. But I guess in terms of the impact that a product like Replica can bring to the market, what does that look like potentially?
Oh, yes. So I think we can elaborate a little bit more on what the enterprise data platform means. I think there's a few aspects to what enterprise data platform that serve this, insight about movement, insight to help maybe urban planning, to help any people who's interested in the built environment and how people move around in this built environment. Number one, I think the most critical part is data. How Replica would aggregate, analyze, and also anonymize, because privacy is at the heart and core of Replica. Analyze all of these data and to produce the insight and produce the informs of origin destination, in terms of people's travel patterns. And when I say anonymization, I do mean anonymization because if you don't anonymize, I think back in maybe 2011, 2012, 2013, New York City released some taxi data. And then obviously people use the location data to match. I believe one person actually published a news article about paparazzi use that data to match, I think, Lindsay Lohan's, some celebrities' location. And that's a huge privacy invasion, right? That's where Replica's focus on privacy in terms of the name, where the name come from, because we build fully synthetic profiles. These are based on real data that doesn't really have PII, doesn't really have that. But we add on top of that additional layer to make sure the insight that you get in aggregate is valid and you can derive information, sort of micro scale decisions. But at individual level, you don't really have privacy factor there. That's, I think, one very critical factor especially in our day and age. I think that's the new generation of data providers, is that privacy and all of these sensitivities needs to be baked in. And the second aspect, besides the data, besides the well-packaged insight that you sort of data in itself you get, you also have a set of tools, visualizations, sort of dashboard, and different kind of maps and visual cues to signify what the trend, time series, bar chart, and line graphs, and all of those for our customer to derive insight in a very easy to use fashion. And combine the data in itself together with the tools, you get a new generation of the enterprise data platform that we're providing. And we already have existing customers. And although we are a very small company, right now we are only about around 40, less than 50 people, but we currently already have a pretty sizable revenue that's validating, that's our public and private sector customers validating the value that we provide to them.
That's pretty amazing. What's a particular use case for the product, for the platform? I know, obviously, having looked at the company, I know a lot of, I saw some stuff about COVID and movement around COVID. So I guess just if you're going to give us a little bit of a use case of how the product could be used, that'd be awesome.
I think if you go to our company's website, replicahq.com, we actually do post quite a lot of content. We do understand sort of the value of use cases to our either existing customers or even potentially new customers. I think the value proposition for new customers is pretty obvious, but there's actually a lot of value in terms of sharing these use cases for existing customers as well, because they can potentially find new ways to make use of our data. So I'll take a couple of examples, I guess. The COVID, there's a lot of trickle-down effect from COVID. We might change how we commute. We might change how we work, right? Like how more distributed fashion, and more immediately is how we reopen, how we understand people's movement patterns so that we understand whether or not our reopen plan has been effective or not. This relates to understanding how people are moving around. So if you look at the latest posts that we have, changing commute, new ways of plan and managing cities, using data to create better reopen plans and how we're moving. And these are all insights. I think having a graphics to accompany what the insight is more intuitive. So I would encourage the audience to actually go read these posts. But roughly, these are the type of insight that we help our customer to gain.
I think it's definitely a very intriguing product. And I guess, I mentioned you've worked for some really big companies and obviously, very well-known brands. People can go to your LinkedIn and see all that stuff. But what I'm really interested in is obviously you come into Replica, it's a different environment, different problems to solve, different scale, right? So when you first joined Replica, you became part of the project and kind of saw what you needed to do. What was the product stage at? Like when you got there, and obviously you'd left some bigger companies, what was your view of the problems you had to kind of tackle?
That's a very good question. I think my involvement with the company was actually through one of my good personal friends, Alexi. Alexi was the technical co-founder of Replica and its former body, Google Sidewalk Labs. And Alexi and I used to be co-chairs of an ACM conference, Six Spatial, that's focused on spatial data. Back in the day, I think it was maybe 8 years ago. And we stayed in touch. At the time, he was still a professor at Berkeley, and I was an engineer on the Twitter's geo team. So we collaborated, and one of our workshop was called Location-Based Social Networks. And that's how I got tied, with the company. We obviously stayed in touch. So I have, I guess, 8 years of maybe a little bit shorter than that, but that's actually a pretty long time in the Bay Area timeframe of context of what the domain does. And all my background is in the field of geo. So joining Replica from before Replica, I used to work at Uber and Lyft. My role at Lyft was actually working on the self-driving division. And moving from self-driving to also a very hardcore science, hardcore engineering, sort of machine learning focused role here is actually feels like coming home for me. I joined in May full time as head of engineering. When I joined, the company already has a validated product market fit. So I think you can say the 0 to 1 phase, which is, in Silicon Valley term, it's actually basically means finding product market fit, including doing things that don't scale, right? Because, doing things that scale before you even find product market fit feels like a premature optimization. And that usually, kills companies. And the team is already built a very impressive product, and there has already been paying customers. So all of that is great. But as with all companies, once you have your first paying customer, first few maybe paying customer, the next question is really to scale up the operation. So the company, I think at the time when I joined 5 months ago, was maybe a little over 20 people. We hired more people since I joined. I think around the time I joined, we had a new COO who I really admire, and it's a Silicon Valley veteran who brought his prior company's IPO in the early 90s. So obviously a ton of experience in terms of scaling there. We also brought in a general counsel from the public sector, so there's a lot of connection there. We brought on the head of product. So clearly you can see the ELT and head of design as well. And we recently are going to do a new design of our tools, which is super exciting. It's going to make our product more intuitive to use and also more memorable. There's a wow factor in the new design. I'm super excited about that. But the overall trend you can see that happens in the past few months, this is, I guess, a very good phase, a necessary phase for all companies to go through, is this sort of 0 to 1 phase where you have a group of people who really knows the domain really, really well and sort of wear multiple hats and bring the product to market and verify it and find the product market fit and figure out business model also. And once you figure all of that out from 0 to 1, then you move on to the more 1 to n or 1 to 100. So you have a few paying customers. How do you get that to the tens? How do you get to the hundreds? How do you get to the thousands? How do you get revenue from maybe a few $100,000 to maybe a few $1 million to maybe over $10 million? That's the scale that we are at right now, over $10 million annual recurring revenue. And that is becoming a scaling challenge. But there's also the gradual step-by-step process as well. You cannot, expect to directly go from 0 to 1 to immediately to 1,000. If you think about it, there's more specialization, division of labor, if you will, so that you have people working on more specialized roles. And that sounds a little bit like you're trying to install red tapes, but it's really not that. It's actually about how we can streamline the operation, how we can streamline the process. There's an intake of the pipeline. Like the data pipeline, if you think about it on the engineering side, used to be, just one gigantic script, if you will. And then if you truly want to scale that up, apply that to one region, let's say one pretty big region, let's say New York, how would you apply a pipeline that's designed for just New York to nationwide, to all over the United States, so that you can quickly deliver the value that you deliver to the customer at one region to another region? How do you do that? Obviously, one way is that you can copy or replicate your gigantic script, if you will. That usually doesn't scale. And another way is that you can scale up the pipeline in terms of you design every single step very well throughout, and you insert QA for every single step, and you compartmentalize sort of the fail-proof point. You insert, fail-proof sanity checks at every single step so that you don't have to rerun the entire pipeline every single time you found an issue towards the very end. So if you think about in terms of cost, actually catching issues of the pipeline much early on is much better than catching an issue at the very later stage, because that really impacts your speed of iteration, right? The time it costs for you to iterate that pipeline. If you catch issues very early on, you are much, much faster to be able to produce something meaningful towards the very end. And that's only one example of the thing that after I come on board, we start to focus more on. This is something that the team has already spent some time focusing on. And one of my job is basically to design the engineering organization so that we have an engineering organization in terms of, team structure and communication structure that makes a team more efficient to be tailoring towards a new working paradigm, and also working together with the other non-engineering organizations. So we have a pretty heavy R&D factor in terms of applying machine learning models. Because we have paying customers, we have a customer success as well as sales organization. And how do engineering organizations support them? How do we work together with product and design so that we can quickly iterate, not only in terms of infrastructure, such as the data quality and all of that, but also on the product side in terms of the UI that our customer will see. How do we integrate, customer feedback early on? And all of that have moving from 0 to 1, do things that don't scale, to 1 to 100, where you need to do things that starting to scale, that kind of thing, because otherwise you won't be able to become a platform company.
Interesting. And let me ask you this, because I think, you brought up a couple interesting aspects of, obviously you have to get to 0 to 1, 1 to 100, 100 to N, however way you want to look at it. So when you join, and you're obviously, there's a product there, you're trying to help scale. Obviously, you have that experience and you're looking at specialization. How far forward are you actually looking? So obviously, you still are focused on scaling. Are you viewing it, I anticipate scale, I need to focus on $1 billion organization? Or it's like, you know what, I need to maybe help us scale to the next milestone? Or is the roadmap just, it's pretty wide, but obviously the accuracy, what you're seeing further down the tunnel might be just different. So how do you view how far forward you're looking and how accurate you might be worried about it being?
Right. That's a very good question. I think that actually touches on sort of the role of engineering management in this. I think there are 4 main pieces, 4 main pillars. This is, by the way, also not what I invented. All of my prior managers and mentors helped me form these ideas. This is actually, these 4 pillars, it's directly borrowed from my previous manager. So there's 4 pillars that engineering management needs to do well. Number 1 is vision. This touches on what you were talking about, is how far of a foresight do you have? Is it 6 months? Usually 6 months is not long enough. Is it 2 years? Is it 5 years? I think it's very hard for people to see out in a 5-year time frame. So 2-3 years might be a sweet spot. For example, right now we have engineer size of 10 to 20 people. So that's around 2 to 3 years. That may be an ideal time frame. You actually may not be able to see that far. You might only be able to see 6 months to 1 year. And then as head of engineering, or you as an engineering manager or director at a bigger company, your job is to how you can extend that foresight, either through outreach to industrial leaders, thought leaders, and thinkers, or talking to the team in terms of also integrating what the engineering constraint and engineering directions. So what are the new framework? What can they enable? Integrate that together with the company's product and sales directions. Are we trying to go, international, or trying to go deep within the US? And what sector are we trying to tackle? Combine all of that together. Do those different sector customers have different needs? All of that ties into the vision. I think that is one of the very critical piece. I think probably applies to all management, not just engineering management. The second pillar of engineering management is execution. can you actually execute? Because if you don't execute, this is the reason why, all four pillars are almost equally important. Without execution, your vision becomes just what's written on a sheet of paper. It doesn't doesn't materialize, and doesn't really work. And that's the vision and execution actually needs to tie in together. How do you do this? Also, can get very hands-on, like in terms of how you do quarterly planning. How do you do a sort of company strategy level planning together with non-engineering organizations, such as where do you purchase new data sources, a landscape analysis of the entire domain, right? So all of that is very important to do. Another aspect of execution is how can you make sure things don't fall through the cracks in terms of when you have sign up delivery, can you actually make sure those are on time delivery? And there's a linearity factor to that as well in terms of if you have quarterly delivery and you deliver everything at the very last day of the quarter, that's actually not a very good execution, right? And that's not very good executed according to plan. So how do you factor all of that in? The third one is people. In terms of our company right now is actually remote, but it's actually, we have a huge presence in both the Bay Area as well as the Kansas area. We also have people working on the East Coast. We have people working in Colorado, North Carolina, or different geolocations. But in the field of engineering, in the field of probably everywhere, why do people want to work with you or work for you or work for this company, right? People needs to have clear vision, clear execution plan to be attracted to your team. I think the foresight actually applies to everyone, to ICs as well as managers, to individual contributors as well as managers, is that you need to externally hire talent that can up-level your team, but also grow your talent from within to make sure that your team have internal growth that they look forward to. This includes fluidity in terms of organizations. People should be able to move around, but maybe not too frequently to the area that they are interested in. People should have career ladder to know what their level expectation, what the next level expectation can bring out from them, and the support that they get from their managers. And the last but not least is the culture aspect. People either in the Bay Area or elsewhere can work for any other companies. They can probably work at Google or Facebook and materialize their gain almost like immediately, right? Generally, working at a startup, you need to wait for a liquidation event for your stock become more valuable, but you have a larger upside where bigger companies immediately get, the liquidation event happens immediately. So why do those people come work with you? This is, again, with a people aspect. How can you ensure that there's a good culture? Good culture doesn't mean, like foosball tables and free lunch. It actually, have a deeper meaning to that. How do we provide feedback to each other in a non-toe-stepping kind of way, in a non sort of offensive kind of way? How do we ensure that people are working collaboratively? How do we ensure there's enough diversity in terms of the thoughts and in terms of the team composition? How do we ensure that different kind of voices gets fostered? And all of these things needs to be considered while the company's business is also trying to scale up. It's a very hard problem, but it's actually, these type of things are what draws me back into the startup domain. Like before Uber and Lyft, I did my own startup also on a platform domain, on a commodity trading platform domain. And in the past 4 years, what I realized is that I do miss that kind of challenge. And that's the reason why I joined back into the early stage startup field.
Interesting. I like that. That's great insight in terms of the pillars that you're leveraging. And I guess just a curiosity. So Obviously you mentioned moving towards specialization, and obviously you have experience, in a startup, you have experience in large organizations. When you're looking to specialize talent, right? Obviously, to help uplift the organization. I guess the timing and how specialized, right? So, I mean, obviously, you can get pretty specialized when you have 50,000 employees. When you have 50, specialization means something else. Like, and just from your perspective, when you're thinking specialization and kind of how you vision the company growing, what do you see?
So I think there are different aspects. That's a really, really good question that I actually have two concrete examples to provide you with. So one of the first role that I hired after I joined Replica is a role called geodata engineer. And a lot of people outside of the domain probably would scratch their head and say, "Oh, is that a like an analyst role to focus on GIS data?" No, it's actually an engineering role. So first and foremost, it is an engineering role. It is, you need to apply the general coding and all of that, algorithms, data structure, and all of that. But the specialization comes in from the actual domain knowledge. So to directly answer your question, I think you should, as an engineering management responsibility, you need to figure out the role that you design. First, it should come from the role that's needed, and you should design the role to find the better fit to the role instead of, oh, you already have someone in mind and sort of design that role to fit that person. That the latter design, I think it's very, some people would call that maybe more people focused or people centered, but I think in the long run, that's actually going to hurt the company. I think in order to design a good role that people can, number one, contribute, have clear expectation to what the company expect of them, and also have clear growth trajectory. I think you don't want to have a role. This also comes in with a vision as well. You don't want to design a role that have a foreseeable lifespan. You want to design a role that actually can see that role keep growing as the company grows. So you don't want to see a role that's, you don't want to design a role. Maybe you should for a contractor position, but I think for full-time positions, you shouldn't design a role that's maybe, like after 6 months, we no longer need that role, because that's more fitting for a contractor position rather than a full-time. I think if you design a role for full-time, you should first try to think how this role fit into the company's long-term plan, long-term strategy. So the geodata role actually fit in quite well. We're never gonna not need data engineers, and we are never gonna, sort of geodata is part of our bread and butter. And surprisingly, we actually never had this role specifically defined before. So luckily, we were able to find someone who have a precise fit on this role. So I think having some industry experience to know what you're looking for and to be able to not design the roles in a way that it's like a unicorn where you are never going to find the perfect person who can do A, B, C, and D all very well together. And then you're going to spend maybe months, if not years, trying to find that. That's also a failure in terms of designing the role. That's one example. The second example is in terms of QA. I think the term QA sort of went through several iterations. If you look at, big companies like SGI or like Yahoo or Microsoft in the 90s and throughout early 2000s, there were very specialized test engineers or specialized QA roles. And those sort of died out in favor of more broadly applicable test framework, where test is, instead of only test engineers writing those tests for you, every engineer is responsible for writing their own test. And there are still very specialized QA engineers. I think the value of those engineers is more gearing towards building the QA framework and building towards automation framework. And I think there's huge value in that. For us, this is one of the roles that we are hiring as well. And we are gearing towards the automation framework. that kind of thing instead of just doing manual QA. Because this goes along what I just talked about in terms of foresight and vision of how the role will fit in to the company's future as well. You don't want to have a role that sort of would die out in the future. And also we are hiring general engineers, machine learning engineers, and infrastructure engineers, security engineer, all of those. Those have a very, very, I would dare to say, probably infinite lifespan. And, there's pretty high career ladder that for people to grow into, like engineering rubric, career pathways for people to grow into. I think that would be a much better sort of organization, division of labor, role definition framework for engineering manager to adapt to.
That's awesome, man. I think you definitely have some fantastic challenges to overcome at Replica. Yeah, your toolbox is full of stuff to try out. And I mean, I'm super excited to see where you're going to take Replica. Obviously, very practical applications. People can go to the website. We'll post some of the blog articles talking about COVID on part of the podcast so that people can kind of see what's happening. But I appreciate you coming on and sharing your views. I think, seems like an amazing opportunity for you personally to kind of scale and grow your team and solve a really bigger scale problem.
Yeah, thank you so much, Amir, for the opportunity. And I really enjoyed our conversation.
Yeah, absolutely, man. Thank you. If somebody wants to reach out to you, because I mean, you obviously laid out a lot of different concepts and thoughts, and I get a lot of times guests get reached out to for follow-ups, because obviously we can only cover so much in the podcast. What's your preferred Twitter, LinkedIn? Is there preferred social media that you want somebody to reach out?
Right now, actually, there's almost like overwhelmingly, so we are all overwhelmed by the amount of information that we live by. And I would recommend the following ways to contact me. Every email I look at is basically a company email. It's sen@replicahq.com. It's sen@replicahq. So if you have urgent topic or potential, if you are looking for a job in this domain, or you just want to learn more and see if you have a fit, feel free to send a note there. And also, if you have just generally want to catch up or chat, feel free to reach out to me on Twitter. My handle is at Alex _SENXU, my full name. That's again at Alex _SENXU.
Awesome, man. We'll include both those in the show notes. So if somebody wants to follow up with you, they certainly can. Again, thank you very much for being on the podcast. I thought this was a great insight into a couple of topics that we hadn't covered. So I appreciate your time. And I guess that is it for this week. We will be back again next week. Always looking for some, ideas of topics that you might want me to cover. So feel free to send me any of those. I've been getting a steady stream and it's been really positive. And then also please subscribe to the podcast. That's the only way we can kind of expand the scope of the podcast. Give it a review if you like. I'm always interested in the feedback. But otherwise, we'll be back next week. Until then, thank you.